And then still more specific, God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life.
Alex O'Connor confronts William Lane Craig, and he gives such an amazing answer, so let's get right into it.
Last time we spoke, we talked about the Kalam cosmological argument, which is a great point of philosophical interest. But at the end of the day, you're not just a theist, but a Christian. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you, actually, was in regards to this kind of thought that somebody maybe would be compelled to take this Pascalian wager at the moment of their death. And this is the kind of story that you often hear of somebody coming to faith in a moment of emotional necessity. What do you think is a more powerful approach to bringing people to the faith of Christianity? Is it things like trying to prove the historicity of the resurrection, or more trying to demonstrate what it is that the resurrection is supposed to represent for people emotionally?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that if you're talking about evangelistic effectiveness, it would be the latter, because I do think that people tend to make decisions primarily on the basis of emotions rather than on the basis of reason. But having said that, I think that many university-educated people are closed to the message of the gospel because they think that it is intellectually uncredible and therefore not something that can be believed by an intelligent person. And so for that reason, I have tried to present the message of the gospel in the context of giving an intellectual defense of the faith. I doubt that very many people will become Christians because of the arguments, but I think that what the arguments can do is give a person the permission to believe when his heart is moved by the message of the gospel.
I see. So when talking to, say, an atheistic crowd, I've seen that in some of your lecture tours, I attended one in person actually when you came to Oxford just before the pandemic, I think. And you tend to use 5 arguments, I believe. I'm not sure if this is still your approach, but you'd lay out, I think it must have been the Kalam, the fine-tuning, and one of the arguments was the resurrection of Jesus. In those instances, when you're talking to university students who are oftentimes going to be predominantly atheist, maybe not in the actual lecture theatre, given the kind of talk that it is, but is your approach here something like, listen to these arguments, they should convince you or compel you at least to move slightly more towards Christianity? Or is it more a sense of, well, let me paint this as an intellectually credible position for you, but actually bringing you to Christianity is going to require something else entirely?
Yes, it's the latter. And so if you look at those arguments, Alex, that I present, they begin with great generality. God is the best explanation why anything at all exists, rather than nothing. And then it becomes a little bit more specific. God is the best explanation of the origin of the universe. And then still more specific, God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. And then the moral argument that God is the best explanation for objective moral duties and values in the world, which raises then, of course, the question of our moral culpability before God. And then I end, typically, with the claim that God can be personally known and experienced. And often I will, if I have time, share here a word of personal testimony from my own experience of coming to Christ. And so it moves from the intellectual to that more personal dimension and attempts to end with a definite personal appeal to people to explore a commitment to Christ and to know him in a personal way. So it's not just an intellectual exercise.
I've heard you describe.
That's so good. Before he finishes that thought, I think that's awesome. At the end of the day, people are not going to convert because they think, but people most of the time have to make a relational decision to follow Jesus more than anything. But it's so important for people to realize you don't have to be intellectually dumb to believe in God. And I think that's one of the biggest lies that a lot of people have been told by the secular culture within their colleges, because a lot of them are atheists.
Described as an evidentialist, and I wonder how much this label applies to you in how much weight you put upon the public evidence for Christianity as reason for your belief. There was a letter that Dostoevsky once wrote to a friend of his, and I can't remember who it was, but in writing this letter, he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it was just about, if I found that all of the facts lay outside of Christ, I'd sooner reject the facts and throw myself with Christ than reject Christ and throw myself in with the fact. This is something that Dostoevsky wrote, which I think goes unremarked upon in religious analyses of his works. What do you make of an approach like that? Is it something that you're sympathetic to, or do you think that if the evidence points in the other direction, that is what should trump any sort of emotional appeal?
Now, those are two different questions. I think that a person can be in a situation in which the evidence points in an opposite direction to what is true. We all know situations in which people are presented with misinformation, for example. So I talked to people in the old Soviet Union before the fall of the Iron Curtain about how they managed to stay Christian despite the constant Marxist propaganda that was fed to them by their professors at the university. And for many of these students, they had no recourse intellectually other than simply their personal experience of Christ, which was so real that they would follow it in opposition to the arguments and evidence of their professors. And I think that is quite legitimate. And for that reason, I'm not an evidentialist in a certain sense of that term, although I think there is adequate evidence to make it more probable than not that Christian theism is true. I don't think that sort of evidence and argument is necessary in order for belief in Christ to be rational. I think that on the basis of the personal experience of God himself, that a person can be rational in believing in Christ. And that's that.
Okay, before he finishes, that's absolutely true. Personal experience, probably the greatest driving force for someone to actually become a Christian or believe in God, because of this experience that they could never, ever comprehend or understand or describe. Yes, evidence is super important, but you can give someone the greatest evidence in the entire world and they're still never going to believe. But again, some people experience some crazy stuff and still not believe as well. You can be right though. Experience can be mistaken. That is 100% true. For me, God revealed he was real in the most personal way. I had a dream and 3 days later it became real. God gave faith to me. That's what Mr. Split says. Yeah.
That fifth point that I mentioned, that God can be immediately known and experienced. And I think for the person who truly knows God, this is a reality that is such that he will be willing to hold to it even in the face of evidence to the contrary, with the hope, of course, that he will find out that, in fact, that evidence against it was illusory or answerable, and hope to get answers to the objections. So there's a difference between what that is and what you said Dostoevsky believed, that if the facts really were against Christ, he would choose Christ rather than the facts. I think that's impossible, because if the facts are that Christ is not God, that he did not rise from the dead, it would be crazy to believe those things. So we want our beliefs to be aligned with the truth, but in our historical situationness, sometimes people are in situations where they don't have adequate evidence to apprehend the truth. And there we can be thankful that God, through his Holy Spirit, has made an immediate knowledge of God accessible to them.
So would you
We can know God, but we can't fully know him until the day we get to be with him in heaven.
say something like, let's say, sufficient evidence, and by evidence I mean things like empirical evidence, analytical reasoning, as opposed to personal experience, might not be sufficient reason to engender a belief in God, but could potentially be a good reason to disbelieve. That, say, if there were evidence strictly to the contrary, if the bones of Jesus were discovered, for instance, to give a famous example, this would be the kind of thing, or I should form it as a question, would this be the kind of thing that would essentially just invalidate all of the religious experience that you may have had in your life, that you say sort of exists in a different evidential plane, but surely upon discovering the bones of Jesus, proving that he never rose from the dead and ascended into heaven, this would give you reason to essentially favor this evidence over the personal experience that you've had with God, such that that personal experience becomes invalidated?
If the bones of Jesus were actually discovered, then the resurrection would be false and you should not believe in it. But I think that given the uncertainty inherent in archaeological discoveries, we're never going to have evidence that the actual bones of Jesus were found. I think the possibility would always be there to say this is probably not actually his tomb. Fortunately, I don't think we find ourselves in that situation, Alex, because I think that the evidence for the historicity of Jesus' resurrection, including the empty tomb, is very strong. And so I don't feel that sort of tension between faith and fact. To me, faith and fact are aligned. But I do realize that for certain people at certain times and places in history, the evidence and the truth can be out of sync with each other. And again, I refer back to my illustration of students in the old Soviet Union who had to persist in faith in spite of the evidence that they had from their professors and teachers. And I think that they were rational to do so.
Well, let's see if you might be able to help out a non-resistant non-believer like myself. You say that we're kind of in the opposite situation to the one that I hypothetically described, in that our historical evidence seems to point towards a resurrection of Jesus. And I'm wondering if we can dive into that a little bit. One question is, do you think it's fair to say that we can't prove historically the resurrection of Jesus? That's not the kind of thing that's open to historical proof. Rather, we can only prove historical facts surrounding the resurrection of Jesus and then ask what the best explanation for those facts is.
Well, I guess I don't see an inherent contradiction between those two things, because I think proving that a certain historical hypothesis is the best explanation and is more probable than not is a form of proof. So it all depends on how much weight you pack into that word prove. If you mean a mathematical demonstration, then of course you cannot, but that's simply inherent in the nature of historical inquiry.
That's why Cliff always is like, I can't prove to you anything, but I can give you enough evidence. I can show you enough evidence, or there's just enough evidence for what I believe. I'd rather believe in that than not believing.
But if you mean prove in the sense of provide good historical evidence for a conclusion to make it more probable than not, in that sense, I think it can be proven.
So here's a question, because this comes up a lot. People will often say that when we look at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, we don't have very much. We have the Gospels, we have the letters of Paul, we have passing reference to Jesus' existence in some extra-biblical texts. This isn't very much. And then a response often comes, okay, maybe this isn't a whole lot, but by the historical standards that we usually apply to look at cases of what may have happened in history, we have this wealth of evidence. You know, if you compare the attestations to Jesus's ministry to any other historical figure of the time, it dwarfs it. Do you think that because of the radical nature of the claim being made here, not just involving the miracles of Jesus's ministry and the resurrection, but also the moral importance of this story and the fact that it's supposed to be essentially the central event of human history, that although we may have a higher standard of historical evidence compared to other average historical facts, we should expect a much higher standard of evidence, perhaps even higher than what we have available to us as it stands?
Yeah, I don't agree with that attitude at all, Alex. And I got myself into some controversy by saying this. Recently, it seems to me that in virtue of what's at stake in believing in the existence of God and Christ, that it would be wrong to demand higher standards of evidence for this. If anything, it would seem to me that one would be more ready to believe if there's any sort of shred of evidence that would be supportive of it because of the tremendous practical benefits from its being true. And this is the
100%. Everyone puts like this crazy pedestal that the evidence has to reach in order for them to believe, where it's impossible, where you can never give any evidence enough for someone to actually change their life and believe, because they put Jesus's resurrection on such a high pedestal for them to do anything different with their life. And I think that becomes a problem. I think if someone's claiming that someone rose from the dead and how everyone completely changed after that, and there's no evidence debunking that Jesus rose from the dead, Isaiah 29:10 says, is talking about all this. Some people are just blind.
the idea of the Pascalian wagering, again, that you mentioned earlier. In addition to being epistemically justified in holding a belief, a person could be practically justified in holding a belief. And I think that belief in Christianity can be pragmatically justified in virtue of the great benefits that are to be had if it turns out to be true. Now, having said that, though, I do think that it is also epistemically justified, and I wouldn't want to be misunderstood there. I just said a moment ago that I think it can be proved, by which I mean that you can show that the best explanation of the established facts concerning the fate of Jesus of Nazareth is the explanation the original disciples gave, that God raised him from the dead. But I wouldn't apply to that epistemic justification a different standard than you would apply to other events in history.
Even despite the fact that this is a far more significant historical event and one which we're expected to believe is authored by a supernatural creator who has a very strong interest in us coming to believe that it occurred. I think this is that even from a secular perspective, there's that old maxim of Carl Sagan's that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I wonder what you think of that, but that would be true even if it weren't for the fact that the extraordinary claim being made here is one that we're supposed to believe that the omnipotent creator of the universe also wants us desperately to believe, and yet the evidence provided is maybe just about in line, maybe a little bit more of what we'd expect from any average historical analysis into the past. Shouldn't we expect a bit more if God wants us to believe this so badly?
This commonsensical slogan that extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence, I think, is demonstrably false. It misunderstands the probability calculus. Events which are extraordinary and therefore highly improbable relative to the background evidence can nevertheless turn out to be highly probable if the evidence on the hypothesis is much more probable than the evidence would be if the hypothesis were false. And so it's just, I think, demonstrably wrong to mouth this slogan that extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. You can have.
But I also think that God has given us enough evidence to believe in him. There's so much evidence everywhere you look, from DNA to the stars, to the galaxies, to the ocean, to how wonderfully complex this entire world is. How can you not see the amazing evidence for our Creator?
Ordinary evidence that will be sufficient to establish an extraordinary event. What's key will be the ratio between the probability of the evidence on the hypothesis and the probability of the evidence on the negation of the hypothesis. Now, again, in terms of what's at stake, there you get into these pragmatic considerations. I mean, epistemically speaking, you shouldn't raise or lower your epistemic standards based on what's at stake. But if you do think that the pragmatic can encroach on the epistemic, that there can be pragmatic encroachment on the epistemic to either raise or lower the bar for belief, then I think it can go either way. And in the case of Christianity, I would say it would lower the bar because of what's at stake. You don't want to miss out by making the bar too high. And that would be the danger you would run. Let me give you an illustration of pragmatic justification that involves lowering the bar. Suppose you're diagnosed with stage 4 stomach cancer, and you're told that you have only a few more months to live and that it looks pretty hopeless. On the other hand, there is this treatment that you can take that a few people have managed to survive the cancer by doing this treatment. And so you decide to take it. Now, if you go simply by what the epistemic evidence would justify, you would believe that you are not going to survive. You are probably not going to make it. But suppose you also know that people who believe that they will make it are shown to have a better chance of survival than those who are realistic. In that case, you would be pragmatically justified in believing that you're going to make it, because that will increase the chances that you actually will make it. So that would be a case where if you allow the pragmatic to encroach on the epistemic, it would serve to lower the bar to make you pragmatically justified in believing something that you're not epistemically justified in believing. But again, Alex, I want to emphasize, I think that Christianity is epistemically justified, and that the facts that establish the resurrection of Jesus, or that undergird it, I should say, are recognized by the wide majority of New Testament historians, and that when you compare the resurrection hypothesis to the alternative hypotheses, it exceeds those hypotheses in terms of meeting the standards for being the best explanation by head and...
Mr. Split says, it's funny, people believe in dinos. Has anyone ever dug one up? Books about them are written 65 million years after. There's skeletons of them everywhere. People dig them up. But have you ever dug one up? Have you ever seen one? No. And the same thing, there's millions of books written about Jesus, and we have so many historical evidences showing that Jesus really did, in fact, live this life. And based off of how people reacted when they claimed that Jesus resurrected, is very logical to actually believe that he did, in fact, resurrect. You guys will not put your life in danger for a lie. Tell yourself honestly, you lie to get yourself out of danger. How contradicting would that be?
Shoulders. So this is all in one sense sort of academic. It's not the situation in which we actually find ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that I want to say about this epistemic bar, but I'm also interested in shelving that to actually talk about some of this evidence. You say that, look, this explanation that of the historical facts around Jesus's death are best explained by a resurrection when you compare them to the alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
Surely it's quite a difficult thing to do to judge the prior probabilities involved here. For example, one explanation that's sometimes given of the facts around Jesus's death is that the disciples all made it up. The disciples were just flatly lying.
Yes.
Now, this might be a bit of a strange suggestion. Why would people be put to death as the disciples were, to die for something they knew to be true? There are various reasons why it might be a bad explanation that they were all lying. But when compared, for an atheist at least, against an explanation that says that there was some divine intervention that led to a man actually rising again from the dead, even though alternative explanations do, I grant you, seem incredibly implausible, whatever happened on Easter morning, it was weird. I don't know what happened that morning, but whatever happened, it was very, very strange. But
Yes.
It doesn't seem obvious to me that even though these different explanations aren't particularly compelling, that should increase my credence in the belief that a man rose from the dead, which seems infinitely less plausible before, all other things being equal.
Before he answers, how is that so less plausible compared to, I don't know, the entire universe being created? If you believe that nothing created something, that's like the craziest miracle in the world. The fact that we actually you guys don't even understand odds that it would take for all of us to evolve to this higher order right now. It's like winning the lottery 1 billion times and your odds are like 100 billion. That's insane. You think that would ever happen? But if there's a creator who knows how to intrinsically design something so perfectly, it's not that crazy that someone could rise from the dead. Someone could rise from the dead, guys. It's not.
Yeah, I don't think that there is anything implausible about miracles if God exists. And so in presenting a case for Christianity, I don't lead with the evidence for the resurrection. I lead with those other arguments that give you a theistic context. Yeah. And if there is a God who created and designed the universe and brought it into existence, then the idea that he might raise someone from the dead is not so implausible. Peter Slezak, an Australian philosopher, in our debate on the resurrection, remarked that for a creator of the universe, the odd resurrection is child's play. And I thought, well, that's really true. So for the atheist who stumbles at the miraculous nature of this explanation, I think he needs to go back to those theistic arguments and review those before coming to the evidence for Jesus' resurrection.
Now, I think my listeners will be broadly familiar, so perhaps without going into too much depth, just bullet pointing, what are the main points of evidence that you would direct people's attention to say these are reasons to think that a man rose from the dead on Easter morning?
First, I would say, what are the facts to be explained? And those would include things like the death of Jesus of Nazareth by Roman crucifixion during Passover around AD 30. Second, his burial or interment in a tomb by a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea. Thirdly, the discovery by a group of his female followers on the Sunday morning after the crucifixion that tomb was empty. Fourth would be that thereafter various individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. And then the last one would be that the earliest disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead despite having every predisposition to the contrary. And then I would ask the question, if those are the facts of the case, and the wide majority of scholars agree with all 5 of those points, then the question is, how do you best explain them? And I can't think of a better explanation than the one that the original disciples gave. when you assess these explanations in terms of the standard criteria for being a good historical explanation, things like explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, degree of ad hocness, consistency with other beliefs, and so on and so forth.
Why could the disciples not have been making it up?
Well, just take one of the facts that they suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised him from the dead, despite every predisposition to the contrary. You would have to.
Yeah, you guys don't understand that the disciples still had a hard time believing that he was God. They barely trusted in him. They had no idea. They thought maybe he was the Messiah, that he was going to take over the Romans and rule and help revolt against the Romans and rule there. No one was thinking that he was God.
Say that that is in fact not a fact. So you would go back to whether or not that is true. And I think that the evidence is that these earliest followers of Jesus did sincerely believe the truth of the message that they proclaimed, and were willing to die for. People don't die for a lie that they have themselves made up. And
Yeah.
so I think that it's very, very plausible that these earliest disciples sincerely believed this. Moreover, if
That's so good. I absolutely love it. I would say for you guys, first, come to grips. Do you believe that there's an actual God out there? And then go to Christianity, because Christianity is definitely the best explanation for God. 100%. So amazing. In the description below, you can click the link to help you decide to follow Jesus for the first time. It will truly just be the best decision of your entire life. Seriously, guys. He will make you into a new creation. He will change your life. He'll give you so much peace and joy, because having a relationship with him is the best thing that you could ever do.